It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never imagined I would settle into a life of polite indifference, where the only thing holding us together was the sheer force of habit. But here we were, Jason and I, two people who had once burned with passion for each other, now simply existing side by side. Our relationship had turned into a quiet, predictable routine. So predictable, in fact, that I could almost set my watch to it. When I look back on our marriage, I can pinpoint the exact moment when the spark started to flicker out. We had been married for almost 20 years, raised two kids, Ethan, our oldest, who just turned 21, and Melissa, our teenager. Ethan had just hit that milestone age where everything seems possible, like he was standing on the edge of something bigger than all of us. But for Jason and me, things had long since shifted to the mundane. The once vibrant conversations were now replaced by silence, the occasional polite nod, or a quick glance over the dinner table. We had created a life together, but I could feel the distance creeping in like a fog. Jason was a good man, dependable, reliable, but he wasn't the man I fell in love with anymore. The man I married had been full of excitement, dreams, and energy. The man I was living with now was more of a shadow, someone who had long since given up on any kind of passion. And I couldn't even really blame him. The years had worn us down. We were simply here, existing. Our house had become a revolving door of kids coming in and out. Ethan and his friends practically lived here. Most weekends, the house was filled with their laughter, the clinking of beer bottles, and the unmistakable hum of youthful energy that buzzed through the walls. And I didn't mind it. In fact, I found it comforting. Seeing Ethan happy, surrounded by people who cared for him, reminded me of a time when life felt less complicated. Among Ethan's friends was a guy named Ryan. Ryan was tall, with sandy blonde hair and a laid-back charm that made him instantly likable. At 24, he was just a few years older than Ethan, but there was something about him that stood out. It wasn't just his good looks. It was the way he carried himself. He had this quiet confidence, this presence that made it hard not to notice him. I tried not to pay too much attention to it. After all, he was just one of Ethan's friends. But, as time passed, I began noticing him more and more. There was something magnetic about Ryan, something that made me feel, something I hadn't felt in a long time. And it unsettled me. It all started one lazy Saturday afternoon. Ethan and his friends were out by the pool, tossing a football around, laughing and making noise. I was in the kitchen, preparing snacks for them when Ryan walked in, wet from the pool, shirtless. I almost dropped the platter I was holding. "Mrs. Carter," he said, flashing me that disarming smile of his. "Do you need help with anything?" I waved him off, trying to keep my eyes focused on the sandwiches I was arranging. "No, thank you, Ryan. You should go back and enjoy yourself." But he didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. His gaze was unsettling. I felt a rush of heat creeping up my neck. "You always take such good care of everyone," he said softly. "You deserve to relax, too." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. His voice was low, sincere, almost like he saw something in me I hadn't seen in myself for years. I brushed it off, trying to laugh it off nervously. "That's what moms do," I replied, hoping to keep the conversation light. But the way he looked at me made it impossible to ignore the tension in the air. I could feel my pulse quicken, my thoughts getting tangled. What was happening to me? Why did I feel this way? I couldn't stop thinking about him. It was ridiculous, really. Ryan was just one of Ethan's friends, a kid, in comparison to me. Yet every time he smiled or laughed, something in me would stir, a feeling I hadn't experienced in ages. It was as if the universe had decided that I had been invisible for too long, and Ryan was the first person to truly see me again. Ethan had invited a few friends over the following weekend, as usual. His group was rowdy, loud, and filled the house with an energy I hadn't felt in years. But this time, something felt different. Ryan seemed to be everywhere. His presence felt more intensely than before. He would always find an excuse to linger, whether it was helping me with dinner or simply standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me work. His gaze was unsettling. I caught myself watching him too. I couldn't help it. "Mrs. Carter," he'd say with that easy smile of his, as if the world could stop for just a moment, and I would be the center of it. I told myself it was harmless, that nothing would come of it. But the truth? I knew it wasn't just innocent. It couldn't be. A few days later, it happened. Ethan was out with his friends, leaving Ryan behind again, claiming he wasn't feeling well. Part of me wanted to believe it, but there was something in the way he kept looking at me that told me otherwise. I had already tried to avoid him, tried to bury the feelings that had been building. But there he was, sitting across from me in the living room, a cup of tea in his hand. The house was quieter, without the usual chaos of Ethan's friends. It felt strangely intimate, the silence hanging between us like a weight we both avoided acknowledging. Ryan listened to me in a way Jason hadn't in years. He didn't rush to fill the quiet with words, didn't glance at his phone every few seconds. He was there, completely present. I found myself talking about things I hadn't said out loud in a long time. My frustrations, my loneliness, even fears I hadn't admitted to myself. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. His gaze was steady, his eyes never leaving mine. It was so different. And then he reached across the space between us and took my hand. "Mrs. Carter, you're incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to feel alive." His words hit me harder than I expected. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the tension building. Before I could say anything, he leaned in, slowly, as if testing the waters. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, then with an intensity that took my breath away. For a moment, every rational thought screamed at me to pull away, to stop, to remember what I was risking. But I didn't. I couldn't. I hadn't felt this wanted, this desired in years. When we finally pulled apart, the sound of Ethan's voice calling from the front door snapped me back to reality. Panic surged through me, and Ryan quickly stepped back, his expression unreadable. I sat there in a daze, my heart racing as I tried to gather my thoughts. The guilt, the exhilaration, it was all mixed up inside me. I couldn't look at Ethan, couldn't meet his eyes for the rest of the night. It wasn't just the kiss, it was everything that had led up to it. The way I had started to feel alive again, like I was more than just a mother, more than just a wife. But it was wrong. I knew that. In the days that followed, Ryan and I never spoke about what had happened. The memory of that kiss hung in the air between us, an unspoken secret we both carried, one that felt like it was too dangerous to acknowledge, too risky to confront. Yet I found myself wondering, what if? I barely slept that night. Jason snoring next to me was a reminder of everything I had left behind. But my mind kept replaying the kiss over and over, the heat of his lips, the way his hand had held mine, the hunger in his touch. It was as if something inside me had been reignited, something I had buried so deep that I didn't even recognize it anymore. Was I more afraid of what had happened, or of how much I wanted it to happen again? The next day, I tried to avoid Ryan. I told myself it was a silly crush, nothing more. Ethan had a group project with his friends, so I assumed Ryan wouldn't be around. But as if the universe was testing my resolve, the doorbell rang late in the afternoon. My stomach dropped when I opened the door. There he was, standing in front of me with a small box of tools in his hands. "Ethan said you needed help with the cabinet in the laundry room," Ryan said casually, though I could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Something deeper. He was nervous too. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually stepped aside, letting him in. As we made our way to the back of the house, the tension between us was almost unbearable. Every step felt heavy, the air thick with the unspoken words that neither of us was brave enough to say. Ryan worked quietly, his usual charm replaced with an unusual seriousness. I hovered near the doorway, unsure of whether to stay or leave, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. When he finished, he turned to me. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart race. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "about the other night, I couldn't breathe." "We can't," I interrupted, my voice shaky. He stepped closer. "Was it really a mistake?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can't stop thinking about you, about how it felt to kiss you." I wanted to push him away, wanted to deny it, to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him either. As he reached out and brushed my cheek, everything I had built around myself came crashing down. "You deserve more than this life," he murmured. "You deserve to feel alive, to feel wanted." And just like that, the walls I had carefully constructed crumbled. The kiss was no longer a question. This time, there was no hesitation.
No guilt.
Just pure, unrestrained passion. I thought I had a handle on everything. I convinced myself that the storm brewing inside me could be controlled, that the fleeting moments with Ryan were just a passing fantasy, a figment of my imagination. But the truth was, every time I saw him, it felt like the ground beneath me shifted. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just a silly crush. It was something deeper, something I wasn't sure I could escape. It was a typical Saturday afternoon. Ethan had invited his friends over, as usual. Their laughter and noise filled the house while I quietly went about my business in the kitchen, preparing snacks for the group. I didn't mind, really. The noise had become background music to my life. A little chaotic, but comfortable. But then, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was.
Ryan.
"Hey, Mrs. Carter," his voice called from the doorway. I tried to focus on the platter of sandwiches I was arranging, trying to ignore the way my heart began to race at the sound of his voice. "Can I help with anything?" he asked casually, leaning against the doorframe, his tall frame filling the doorway. His gaze lingered on me, and for a moment, I felt as though the room was closing in. "No, Ryan, I've got it," I replied, my voice a little too sharp, hoping to sound composed. But deep down, I could feel the nerves twisting in my stomach. It was always like this when he was around, my body betraying me with feelings I wasn't ready to confront. Ryan didn't move. He just stood there, watching me in silence, his presence like a weight in the air. I could feel his eyes on me, and despite my attempts to remain calm, I felt my pulse quicken. He wasn't leaving.
And I didn't want him to.
"You always take care of everyone," he said softly, his voice low and sincere. "It's like you're always putting others first. You deserve to relax, too." His words hit me harder than I expected. He was watching me, really watching me, and it felt like he could see right through the facade I had carefully built around myself. It was as though he knew that for years I had been doing everything for everyone else, and in the process, had forgotten about myself. I wasn't sure how to respond. A part of me wanted to laugh it off, to brush it aside, but there was something in the way he said it, something in his eyes, that made it impossible to ignore. I couldn't. "It's just what I do," I muttered, trying to laugh it off. "Moms, right?" But he didn't laugh. He just stood there, still looking at me with that intensity, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the room was palpable, thick and suffocating. I could feel it building between us, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to pull away or lean in closer. "You shouldn't have to do it all alone," Ryan said, taking a step closer. "Everyone needs a break sometimes, Mrs. Carter." The way he said it, the way he looked at me, it felt like more than just a casual comment. It was personal. And for a moment, I found myself forgetting where I was, forgetting the reality of my situation. His words were like a spark, igniting something inside me that I had buried for so long. I felt vulnerable, exposed. My heart raced, my hands trembling slightly as I placed the sandwiches down on the counter. This was wrong. He was just a kid, barely older than Ethan. What was I doing? I could feel my face flushing, the heat rising to my cheeks. And in that moment, I wasn't just a mother or a wife. I was a woman again. A woman who wanted to be seen, wanted to be noticed. But before I could say anything, Ryan stepped closer, his voice lowering. You deserve to relax, to have someone take care of you for once. You deserve to be happy. The words sent a rush through me, a rush of emotions I wasn't prepared for. His presence was overwhelming now. His scent, the warmth of his body so close to mine, it made everything else fade into the background. It was just us. In that moment, it was only Ryan and me, and the growing tension that had taken root between us. I could feel my breath hitching in my throat as he stepped even closer, and I tried to steady myself, but it was no use. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and desire, and I couldn't make sense of it. I don't know what to say, I whispered, my voice shaky. I was trying to pull back, but everything in me wanted to reach for him. Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he simply reached out, brushing his fingers gently along my arm. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I couldn't stop myself. For a moment, I closed my eyes, just to savor the feeling of being touched like this again, wanted, desired. But then the sound of laughter from the living room broke through the moment, and with it, the cold, harsh reality of where I was, who I was. I quickly pulled away, heart racing, the guilt flooding in. Ryan, we can't, I said, my voice barely a whisper, as if the words were meant to stop something that had already been set in motion. But Ryan's gaze didn't falter. He took another step closer, his expression unreadable. You don't have to do it alone, Mrs. Carter, he said softly, his words hanging in the air, heavy with meaning. And just like that, I knew it was too late to turn back. Everything had already changed. It was a quiet evening. The kind of evening that felt different somehow, as if the world outside had faded into a distant background, leaving only the two of us in the house. Ethan had gone out with his friends, laughing and joking, leaving me alone with my thoughts. For the first time in weeks, the house felt still, almost eerily silent. But then Ryan stayed behind. He claimed he wasn't feeling well, which I found odd. He was always so full of energy, always so active. But there was something in his eyes when he said it that made me pause. He didn't look well. He looked distant. Maybe it was just an excuse, but part of me knew he was staying behind for another reason. A reason that had nothing to do with being sick. I offered to make him some tea, the least I could do. After all, we were both alone in this quiet house. Do you want some tea, Ryan? I asked, trying to sound normal, though my voice betrayed me with its hesitation. He nodded, that slight smile of his tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't say anything as he followed me into the kitchen, and we settled into the familiar routine of preparing tea. The silence between us was comfortable, but it was charged with an undercurrent of something I couldn't put my finger on. We sat together on the couch, the faint sound of traffic outside the only thing that broke the silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my chest as we started to talk. It wasn't the usual small talk. It was deeper, more meaningful. Something about the stillness of the night, the intimacy of being alone together, made everything feel different. Ryan was a good listener. He leaned in, paying attention to every word I said, his eyes fixed on mine as I spoke. I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't done in years, not even with Jason. I talked about my life, the frustration of feeling like I was stuck in a cycle, the loneliness that had crept in without me even realizing it. For a moment, I forgot about everything, my responsibilities, my marriage, the guilt that should have been there but wasn't. All I could focus on was the way Ryan was looking at me, the way he listened as if everything I said mattered. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice, just listened. It was so rare, so intoxicating. I hadn't realized how starved I was for someone to actually listen, to see me. But Ryan did. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. When I finished, there was a long pause between us. I couldn't bring myself to look away from him, and I could tell he felt it too. His gaze softened, and for a moment, I could see the vulnerability in his eyes. It was almost like he was afraid to say something, yet at the same time his body language screamed that he needed to. Before I could react, he reached out. His hand brushed mine gently, and I couldn't move. My heart seemed to stop, and the rest of the world around us disappeared. The soft touch of his fingers on my skin made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. Then, without a word, he leaned in. The space between us closed, and his lips found mine, tentative at first, then with more urgency. It was slow, but it felt like a release, like something that had been building up for a long time. His kiss was soft but full of hunger, a desire that I had buried deep inside me for years. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped him. I knew what we were doing was wrong, that this could destroy everything. But in that moment, all of those thoughts seemed so far away. I hadn't felt this alive in so long. I hadn't felt wanted, needed, and I couldn't bring myself to stop. My mind screamed at me to stop, to remember who I was, who we were, but my body betrayed me. It felt so good, so right, in a way I couldn't explain. I had forgotten what it felt like to be kissed like this, to feel desired. The passion between us surged, taking over every thought, every reason to stop. It was as if this moment was the only thing that mattered. I pulled away, breathless, my head spinning. My heart was pounding, and I was unsure if it was from the kiss or the overwhelming rush of emotions I couldn't process. Ryan's face was inches from mine, his breath just as uneven as mine. He didn't speak, but the intensity of his gaze said everything. I should have said something, anything. I should have stopped this, but the words wouldn't come. I was too overwhelmed by the feeling that had consumed me. And then, as if the world had snapped back into place, reality hit. Ethan's voice echoed from the front door. He was back. My heart nearly stopped. Panic surged through me, and Ryan quickly stepped back, his expression unreadable. We sat there in silence for a long moment, neither of us daring to speak. I couldn't meet Ryan's eyes, couldn't even think straight. The guilt hit me like a wave, crashing over every thought I tried to hold on to. I had just crossed a line I couldn't erase. I had kissed him. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to pretend like everything was okay. But I couldn't. The kiss still lingered on my lips, the heat of it, the forbidden nature of what we had just done. The door opened, and Ethan's voice filled the air. I didn't know what to do, what to say. I couldn't look at Ryan. I couldn't look at anyone. This wasn't supposed to happen. And yet it had. I barely slept that night. My mind was in turmoil, spinning out of control with every passing thought. I lay next to Jason, his steady breathing and rhythmic snoring a harsh contrast to the storm raging inside me. His presence beside me only seemed to amplify the overwhelming guilt I felt, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened with Ryan. The kiss. The feel of his lips on mine, the way he held me, the way he made me feel alive. It wasn't just the physical sensation. It was the rawness of it, the passion. For years, I had lived a life of routine, of politeness, of doing what was expected. I had been so caught up in being a wife, a mother, a caretaker that I forgot what it meant to be a woman, to feel wanted, to feel alive. And Ryan had reminded me of that. He had made me feel something I thought I had lost forever. But that kiss, it was wrong. I knew it. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The consequences of what we had done were too great. If anyone found out, if Jason knew, what would happen to my family? What would happen to everything I had worked for? I couldn't even bring myself to look at Jason the next morning. As I lay there, pretending to sleep, I could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on me, suffocating me. The shame was unbearable, but at the same time, there was something else, something I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself. The desire to feel that connection with Ryan again, to experience that passion once more. I tried to push those feelings away, to tell myself it was just a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the memory. The warmth of his lips, the intensity of his gaze. The way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was Ryan. It wasn't just about the kiss, it was about everything that came with it. The way he looked at me, the way he listened to me, the way he made me feel like I mattered again. I told myself over and over that it couldn't happen again, that I was just a fool, caught up in a fleeting moment of desire. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. There was something more to it, something deeper that I wasn't ready to confront. The days dragged on in a haze of guilt and confusion. I avoided Ryan as best I could, but every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, I felt that pull, that magnetic attraction that I couldn't deny. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop myself from thinking about him. I knew it was dangerous, that it could destroy everything. And yet, part of me couldn't help but want it, couldn't help but crave the feeling of being desired, of being wanted. Jason was oblivious, of course. He had no idea what had happened, what was going on inside me. He was still the same as always, distracted, distant, lost in his own world. It wasn't that I didn't love him, it was just that I didn't know how to love him anymore. He had become a stranger to me, a shadow of the man I had once married. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the passion I once felt for him had long since faded. But Ryan made me feel something. Something dangerous. Something forbidden. It wasn't just the physical attraction, it was everything about him. The way he made me feel alive again, the way he saw me, truly saw me. I couldn't stop thinking about him, couldn't stop wondering what it would be like to feel his hands on me again, to taste his kiss once more. I told myself I was being foolish, that I was just a woman craving something she hadn't felt in years. But every time I saw Ryan, I was reminded of the longing inside me, the need for something more. I couldn't deny it any longer. Part of me wanted to see where this would go, to let myself fall into the temptation, to feel wanted, desired, alive again. But the other part of me, the part that knew what I stood to lose, screamed at me to stop. The truth was, I was torn. Torn between the life I had built with Jason and the dangerous, forbidden attraction I felt toward Ryan. I couldn't keep living in this state of conflict. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I couldn't stop thinking about him. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. The next day, I told myself I would ignore it. I would pretend that what had happened between Ryan and me had been a mistake, an anomaly, something I could push out of my mind and forget. I wasn't ready to face it. I wasn't ready to confront the mess of emotions it had left inside me. But of course, it wasn't that simple. The doorbell rang in the late afternoon, a sound that made my heart drop. I froze for a moment, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I already knew who it was before I even opened the door. Ryan stood there, just as he had before, his hands carrying a small toolbox. He looked casual, but his eyes betrayed him. They were searching, looking at me with an intensity one hadn't been able to forget since that night. "Hey, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice almost too calm. "Ethan told me you needed help with the cabinet in the laundry room again." It looked like it was still a little loose. I forced a smile, but inside, I felt the tension rising between us. It was as if the air itself had thickened, charged with all the unspoken words and emotions we both carried. I stepped aside, allowing him into the house, trying to appear unaffected, but my mind was racing. I led him to the back of the house, feeling every step we took toward the laundry room, as if the distance between us was growing smaller with each passing second.
He was so close now.
Too close. The room felt suffocating as Ryan set down his toolbox and got to work. I tried to focus on something, anything, but all I could think about was the kiss. The memory of it flooded my mind, replaying over and over again in vivid detail. I could still feel the heat of his lips, the way his hand had held me, the way his touch had made me forget everything. "Everything okay?" Ryan's voice broke through my thoughts, and I realized I had been standing there, lost in my head, for longer than I realized. I nodded quickly, trying to push the feelings away. "Yeah, just thinking," I muttered. Ryan didn't say anything for a moment, but the tension in the air between us grew thick, almost unbearable. He continued working, his movements precise, but I could feel him glancing at me every few seconds, as if waiting for something. Finally, he put the tools down and turned to face me. His expression was serious now, his eyes searching mine, looking for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, his voice low and earnest. About that night, my heart raced and I took a step back, not sure how to respond. I had convinced myself that I would ignore it, that it didn't matter. But now, hearing him speak of it, I realized I couldn't. "We can't," I whispered, my voice trembling.
It was a mistake.
"It shouldn't have happened." Ryan's gaze didn't waver. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I don't think it was a mistake," he said quietly. "Not for me." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came.
I didn't know what to say.
I didn't know how to explain that this shouldn't be happening, that it couldn't happen again. Ryan stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What happened between us? I can't forget it." I felt my chest tighten. He was so close now that I could feel his breath on my skin, his presence surrounding me. I knew I should back away, that this was dangerous, but the pull toward him was so strong. The way he was looking at me, the way he made me feel, it was impossible to ignore. "You deserve more than this," Ryan continued, his words soft but firm. "You deserve more than this life you've settled for. You deserve to feel alive again. To feel wanted." I felt my knees go weak at the intensity of his gaze. The guilt was still there, buried under layers of fear and shame, but underneath it all was something else, something I hadn't felt in so long. The desire to be seen, to be wanted. I wanted to pull away, to tell him to stop, to tell him this was wrong. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, frozen, torn between the life I had and the life Ryan was offering me. A life of passion, of desire, of being more than just a wife or a mother. I could feel the walls around me beginning to crumble. I had built them so carefully, so deliberately, but now they felt fragile, weak. As if one more word, one more touch, would bring them crashing down. Ryan took another step closer, closing the distance between us. My breath caught in my throat. He reached out, his hand brushing my cheek, and in that moment, everything inside me screamed to stop. But I didn't stop. That evening, everything felt different. The air was thick with unspoken words, and every glance exchanged between us carried the weight of what had happened before. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was something deeper, something I wasn't prepared to face. Ryan and I couldn't stay away from each other. It was as if there was an invisible force pulling us together, no matter how much we both tried to resist. We found ourselves once again in the laundry room, a place I never imagined would hold such significance. The space, usually so mundane, now felt heavy with our desires. He was standing so close to me, his presence overwhelming. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each breath shallow, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. For so long, I had been caught in the routine of my life, wrapped in the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood, but now, in this moment, I felt as though I was being reminded of a part of myself I had long neglected. Ryan's eyes locked with mine, and everything around us seemed to blur into the background. It was just us here and now. The kiss, the way his touch felt, all of it surged within me like a tidal wave, erasing the doubts and the guilt, if only for a moment. I forgot everything, the responsibilities, the choices, the life I had built. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive, seen and desired. It was a sensation so intense that I couldn't bring myself to pull away, couldn't bring myself to stop. But when everything finally came to a halt, the world came rushing back, and with it, the crushing weight of what we had done. The guilt hit me like a wave, overpowering the fleeting pleasure I had allowed myself to experience. I stood there, my mind spinning, overwhelmed with shame. What had I just done? What did this mean? I could still feel the rush of emotions, but the consequences of my actions, of what had just happened between us, settled in like a heavy blanket, smothering me in its weight. I had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure how to move forward from here. Despite the shame, there was something else lingering inside me, a truth I couldn't deny. The memory of that moment, the way I had felt, was something I knew I wouldn't forget. No matter how much I tried to push it away, no matter how much I tried to tell myself it was wrong, it had happened.
And it was a part of me now.
Ryan's eyes met mine once more, and I saw the same confusion, the same mix of guilt and longing in his expression. We both knew we couldn't go back. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The weight of our secret hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. There was no going back, no erasing what had happened. And though I was filled with regret, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. What would we do now? How would we live with this? I turned away, feeling the sting of shame creeping in. This can't happen again, I whispered to myself, more than to him. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't the truth. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was something else, something that would continue to haunt me long after the night ended.